Hello and welcome to a new series we're doing at Recovering Reason, Memeology, where we take on lame memes from both Christians and atheists and break them down. So, this is the first edition. Welcome aboard. Here we go. Okay, the first meme comes to us from it was shared by Break the Spell, and it's originally from Hammer the Gods, some page or other on Facebook. So it has to do with the headline is things that are far more likely than a virgin birth. Let's cue it up and take a look. First of all, pet peeve, why quotation marks around the phrase virgin birth? I mean, why go metalinguistic there? The theory is an actual virgin birth. There's no reason to put quotations marks around it. There's literally no canonical usage of quotation marks to make those justified there. It's just that's kind of a pet peeve with me. It's kind of a sign of ignorance when people use quotation marks indiscriminately. So I cannot pass over that. Okay, so here's a general problem with memes like this. So he gives three scenarios that he thinks are far more likely than an actual virgin birth. Here's the and it was originally posted on the Christian Apologetic Support Group. Somebody said, "How would you respond?" And the problem is this: people get caught up in the people go after the red herring. They don't see the fundamental fallacy behind memes like this, because you see these sorts of things actually quite frequently. So they get caught up a lot of times in defending the truth of the doctrine of the virgin birth. That's not the thing to do here. The question is whether or not, the question is how to address these questions of what's more likely than what in a more general way, because you can't even go down the rabbit hole on this sort of thing. There are two kinds of probability. Well, there's lots of kinds of probability, but one fundamental binary distinction is between a priori probability and a posteriori probability. Okay, that is, there's a couple different ways to do this distinction, but the most common way to do it is a distinction between the probability of a proposition, or the a priori probability in one sense is what sometimes is called the intrinsic probability of a proposition, the probability that it has apart from anything else, before you learn anything else. Okay, so the a priori probability of rolling an ace on one roll of a single fair die is 1 in 6. We're going to do the Dora the Explorer kind of thing here. Now, if you know something about the die, if you know something about its composition and the velocity with which it's thrown, the angle, etc., you might be able to calculate something more than that. You might say, okay, well, prior to any other knowledge, it's 1/6, but I may learn some things that make it more than that. Or what's the probability of pulling the ace of spades out of a deck of cards? Well, I don't know. How was it shuffled? How many times was it shuffled? Was it shuffled by a machine? Was it shuffled by a pro, by a novice? You have once you know information like that, it changes your probability judgment. Okay, a posteriori probability is the probability of a proposition after you take into account some relevant bit of data that you've learned. Okay, another usage of a priori and a posteriori probability has to do with steps in an argument where you add in information. So in a cumulative case argument, you might start with your intrinsic probability and then add in some empirical probability, and that becomes your new starting point, your new a priori in that sense. And then you add in new information, and in each case you say, okay, here's what it was before I considered. For any given bit of evidence E, there's the probability the proposition has before you learn E, and the probability that proposition has after you learn that E. Okay, so the probability of any proposition is completely dependent on the background information that you're taking for granted. Okay, now, big distinction in a proposition like a virgin birth. do you include in your prior information that there's a God, or do you not? And we'll have none of this nonsense about like, oh, he gets to assume no, because that's some negative proposition. That's ridiculous. Um, Look, we'll have the debate about God, right? We'll debate that. We'll debate that all day long. The question is, how probable is a virgin birth, given that there's a God versus given that there's not? Yeah, you're right, buddy. If there isn't a God, if you're taking for granted that there isn't a God, if you've settled for yourself that there isn't a God, then yeah, these other things are more likely. That's right. But so what? So what? If you've settled in your mind that there is a God, or if it's more probable for you that there is a God, then these things may not be so unlikely, especially if you add in certain things about either prophecies or the life that Jesus lived or things like that. Then the probability of a virgin birth goes up. Also, what's at stake here? What's at stake here? I've never met anybody who argued for theism from the premise that Jesus was born of a virgin. Quite the contrary. Everybody that I know who accepts the virgin birth does so on the authority of Scripture, because they've already settled in their mind that it is highly likely that there's a God, and they've already settled in their mind that the Scriptures are likely in some way or other endorsed by God or sent forth by God. Okay? So given that fact, and it is a fact, this meme has zero dialectic strength. It's pointless. There's no point for it to make. It misses the point completely, because it doesn't, because the probabilities are in general dependent upon what you have in the background information, and you can't use thinking like this to somehow affect the debate about God, because your views on this are going to presuppose your views about God. Okay. Now let's bring it back up, because I want to talk a little bit about the second part of it, because unbelievably you hear this kind of garbage as well sometimes. So let's cue the slide back up for a second. All right, so this is just rude, talking about ignorant men nearly 2,000 years ago. So my first degree was in classical languages and literature. And my first teaching job, long before I taught philosophy at the university level, was teaching ancient history and classical literature along with Greek and Latin. And the idea that people 2,000 years ago were ignorant is so, I mean, it's like, whoever wrote this has to be ignorant. Because if they've read much from people 2,000 years ago, they're going to understand that Aristotle might be the smartest person who ever lived. Leibniz has a pretty good claim to that, maybe Euler, some other people, but Aristotle has a very good claim to being the smartest person who ever lived, and he was not alone. If you know about the Stoics, and that was well more, 400, almost 400 years more than 2,000 years ago. And if you know anything about the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers who existed around the time of Jesus, then you realize these people 2,000 years ago were freaking geniuses. Almost all the semantic paradoxes that we teach at the university level were discovered by the Stoics. And some of the principles of modal logic were as well. I keep looking at the meme so I can know what it says. So the claim, the attribution of ignorance to people 2,000 years ago is itself ignorant. Now, suppose he says, well, I'm talking about the average person. Well, yeah, the average person is probably smarter than this person too, because the average person had to live a real life connected with nature. And I tell you what, they certainly understood 2,000 years ago better than people do today. The life cycle, sex, birth, work, death. They understood that because they were closer to it, because they lived it, because it happened, all of it, in their living rooms. Unlike the sanitized life we have today, the plasticine life we live today, cut off from nature. So this was written by an ignoramus. somebody who's ignorant, and yet they're attributing ignorance. People were very well aware of where babies came from 2,000 years ago, and it's embarrassing to have to say this to hammer the gods, and break the spell. Shame on them for putting together something so misguided, pointless, and stupid. It's an embarrassment. So, but the number one lesson I want you to take away from this is that when people make claims about probabilities, and when they cast aspersion upon miracle claims because they're unlikely, don't buy it. You go right back and you say, likely with respect to what? Likely given what? Because if there's a God, I mean, I saw a clip from Joe Rogan the other day on a video by Cameron Bertuzzi, and the guy's an idiot. The guy, why do people listen to this guy? Why does anybody listen to Joe Rogan? He's an idiot. It's unbelievable. To call miracles into question because they're unlikely is unbelievably stupid. Either there's a God or there isn't. Let's debate that. I'd love to debate Joe Rogan on that. He'll never hear of me because he's insulated by his inexplicable fame. But boy, I'd do it in a heartbeat. We'd have that debate. Either there's a God or there's not. And if there is a God, then miracles are like not hard for him. If there's a God that can create the cosmos, if there's a God that can dictate the natural laws and sustain the universe in being, then it's not that hard to do something a little different than he normally does. Because that's all a miracle comes down to, if theism's true. So let's just talk about if theism's true. All right? And do I have Swinburne's book on the resurrection here? It's usually within arm's reach. I got 4 other Swinburne books within arm's reach. So let's talk about miracles. You want to debate miracles? Let's debate miracles. But let's do it using Bayesian confirmation theory. Let's look at N.T. Wright, Richard Swinburne, maybe a little Bill Craig, and Gary Habermas, my old teacher. Let's debate the resurrection. Let's debate God, and let's debate the resurrection. Let's do that. But none of this garbage about miracles being unlikely, because of course they're unlikely. The one of the Greek words for I actually can't remember the Greek word right now, but in Latin it's mira, and one of the things that in a good translation, some translations still do this. I forget which ones, but some New Testaments translate miracle as signs and wonders. Signs and wonders, because miracles were not just like anomalous events. Miracles were meant to signify or certify some message. Okay, so the whole point is that they're unlikely to get people's attention, and either there's a God that can do that or there isn't. And let's have that debate, and let's not have this BS about miracles being unlikely and somehow that's relevant, because it's not.